Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Halal Gap. I'm your host, Sofia Alani, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sikandar and our podcast producer, Asif Qureshi. Today, we're coming at you with something a little different. Like so many of you, we too at the Mosquers have been horrified to see the recent violence, death, and destruction in Palestine. To help us understand the context, history, and nuance, today we have a very special guest for this very special episode.
He is a human rights activist focused on the Palestinian community and has served in various positions with the Canada Palestine Cultural Association, most recently as their vice president. He was a driving force behind the first ever Palestine Pavilion at Edmonton's Heritage Festival and is a regular contributor to local, national, and international news agencies for his expert opinions. His work in multimedia and activism has also landed him opportunities to work with the likes of the United Nations and many others. Joining us from right here in Edmonton, we are so pleased to have with us today, Mousa Qasqas. Mousa, thank you so much for joining us.
No,
little celebration in the background. We're going to pretend like that was one take.
Okay.
So, Mousa, as we all know, the Palestinian plight is one that has more recently started to come back in the spotlight, but obviously it's not new, right? And so I think maybe for the benefit of us and for our listeners, I'm going to give you a big task of providing us in as brief as possible and as digestible a way possible, a little bit of a history lesson in terms of how we got to where we are today.
Sure, yeah. No, first of all, I want to say thank you very much, you guys, for having me. That intro was amazing. Made me sound a lot more important than I actually am, but thank you for that. And the podcast's awesome. I think what you guys are doing is really, really good. It's contributing to what I think is important, is changing the narrative, specifically about Muslims and Palestinians, because as you know, with Palestine, there's a huge religious dynamic, right? We always talk about it's not a religious war. It's not, in the sense that how Israel reacts, and they don't care if you're Christian, Muslim, or Jewish. Their reaction is very aggressive, and it's a Zionist movement and all this stuff. But I think it's important that people understand, like we were saying off camera earlier, like your Muslim Palestinian is not just that kid throwing rocks, right? They're very dynamic. It's a very eclectic population there. So let's go back then, and as quickly as I can, how far back should we go here? So I think because we are going to talk about Zionism a lot, and I think it's one of those words that's just kind of thrown around and people are like, cool, it's like if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about Palestine, just throw out the word Zionism. So we have to always differentiate between Zionism and Judaism and Israel. Zionism is basically just, it is basically people who wanted a home for Jews, in the state of what they now call Israel. The problem with Zionism is they wanted the home to be just for Jews, and they want Jews to have rights over other people that other people didn't have. So I've described it in the media as apartheid and even systemic racism, which I will prove later on. We can talk about it. But this Zionist movement started a long time ago, early 1800s. A guy named Theodor Herzl, a guy named Chaim Weizmann, they kind of put this idea together of, hey, we need a homeland for the Jews. At the time, to be honest, rightfully so. The Jews were being persecuted. Unfortunately, it wasn't the Palestinians or the Muslims that were persecuting them. Most of it was European Christianity and these types of things. So the idea itself started out as somewhat a noble idea of, listen, we need a homeland for these people that are being persecuted. So they used to have these World Zionist conferences and talk about it. And I don't know how many people know, but like the first place that they considered as a homeland for the Jews was in Israel. They had a place in South America, somewhere near Venezuela, and then there was an African country. I should have looked this up. I can't remember, but one of the African countries they had suggested to the Zionists, why don't this be your homeland? They didn't like that. They thought, you know what, we could attract more Jews to Israel if there was some connection, right? There's no connection in Africa or South America, but obviously the Holy Land, they could get a big following. So they decided on Israel. That started early 1800s. So around that, you had 1917, Palestine was British mandated, right? 1919, they cut up the map of the Middle East of what it is today. There's actually a really good book about that called A Peace to End All Peace, if you want to know how the Middle East came to be cut up the way it is today. Great book actually on that. So in 1919 they cut that up. 1917 it was the Balfour Declaration, which Lord Balfour from Britain told the world Zionists that, you know what, we're going to have a homeland for the Jews in Israel. A lot of things happened along the way. 1948 Israel became a country, right? There was a lot of terrorism at the time, like terrorist Israeli groups, the Irgun, there's a number of different ones that are actually still terrorist organizations even by Western standards today. So there was a lot of stuff. In 1948, 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians were displaced in that year, in 1 year. So they were kicked out of their homes. This is the day that Palestinians called the Nakba, if you've ever heard the term Nakba. Nakba just means great catastrophe in Arabic. And basically, Independence Day for Israel is Nakba Day for the Palestinians. So the day Israel became a state is the great catastrophe for Palestinians. Because again, 800,000 of them were kicked out of their homes. There was massacres in many villages. 1948, they became a state. 1967 is when the occupied territories were formed in the Six-Day War. Syria, Egypt, some of the Arab countries went to war with Israel. They lost the war, and then the UN got involved and said, okay, fine, you can remain where you are, but the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem are occupied territory. And this is very, very important for later on and for today when we talk about international law. That's where all these laws come up, was from 1967 when these places became official occupied territory. In the 70s, there was 73, there was a war, there was a couple other wars, and essentially in these wars, I don't want to get into the details of the war, but what it was, again, like we're complaining about today, you have a military superpower backed by the United States, the biggest military in the world, fighting smaller countries that, like to talk a lot, but don't have a lot of power, right? I don't want to get into too much in the history and stuff, but Gamal Abdel Nasser, he's known in the West, one of the greatest leaders in the Arab world, Egyptian leader, died with nothing but, a home and not even a vehicle. He was the kind of guy, like if you read his biography, they say that when he did speeches, the stock market in the West would be affected. This is how big a leader he is. In the Arab community, there's a lot of, different opinions about him. He actually assassinated one of the biggest leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, a guy named Sayyid Qutb, who was a really big guy. And so we had a lot of conflicts internal along the way, but Gamal Abdel Nasser was one of the biggest proponents of, pan-Arab nationalism in a way, but also he was a very big supporter of Palestine. When he died, the whole Palestine dream kind of died. That's when Egypt got Anwar Sadat, who signed a peace agreement with Israel. And from that day on, it was just like there was no more really Arab countries supporting Palestine. It became a movement of the people, right? A bottom-up approach rather than top-down, the Palestinian struggle. So then we got to, all the accords, the Oslo, Taba, there was 5 or 6 of them. And as Palestinians, we sat and watched. They offered nothing to the Palestinians, everything to the Israelis. And then, the Palestinians would say no, and the world would demonize them, and they say, look, Israel reached out for peace. They said no. There's this line in the Israeli propaganda where they call it the 3 no's, the famous 3 no's, where Palestine said no, no, no to these agreements. Yasser Arafat at the time was the leader, and he said no. So that's been the timeline historically. If you look at like the Western narrative, unfortunately, before even as recent as like any time before 10 years ago, most of the media, most of the news on Palestine was all filtered through one source. And I think that's why it's changing, because now the media, as you guys know, like this podcast is a perfect example, information is not filtered through one source anymore, or as a limited amount of sources, maybe not one, but now the media is, any kid in Gaza has a cell phone and can show you, we'll talk about this, but Sheikh Jarrah, which started all this, Palestinians literally being kicked out of their homes. An Israeli official referred to it about, I think it was like 16 days ago, as a private real estate dispute. And I'll explain exactly what it was. It was literally, by definition, it was ethnic cleansing. He referred to it as a private real estate dispute. Now, if this was the 90s, that's everyone would have to say, well, it's private real estate dispute. We can't see what's happening on the ground. There's no media in Palestine in the 90s that can broadcast to the world. This is why it's changing, right? This approach. So today we're at, the way Israel's designed today is you have Israel, which is, not occupied territory, but actually Israel, ruled by Israel. Then you have the occupied territories. You have Gaza, which we know is just a siege. It's open air prison, right? Not just me as a biased Palestinian saying this, Dave Cameron, British Prime Minister, who's very conservative, he was actually the first person to call it an open air prison. That's where it came from. People think it was Noam Chomsky or Norman Finkelstein that said it. It wasn't. It was a conservative British prime minister. So if he's saying it's an open-air prison, trust me, it's an open-air prison. So that's Gaza, and then you have the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which are...
And how big is Gaza? Like, how many people?
Gaza is literally...
Can you equate it from like
probably
an area
down...
perspective?
It's a lot of... I've heard people say half of Edmonton. That's not true. Edmonton's 684 square kilometers. Gaza's 365 square kilometers.
Okay,
so half the city.
Yeah.
You pick north side or south side, that's Gaza. Literally.
And there's a really dense population in that space too.
Yeah, so 2.2 million people in an area the size of it. Yeah, it's hard to say half of Edmonton because that number I gave you of Edmonton is literally if you enclose the Henday, right? Anything outside the Henday is not part of that 684. So you're actually talking about like Castle Downs and like 2 other neighborhoods, right? And you're talking about 2.2 million people.
In that small space.
We have, in the same area, we probably have about 400,000 maybe, if you're looking at the half of that we're talking about. So it's a very dense population. 4 years ago, the UN referred to it as the most densely populated city in the world. Recently, I looked it up just as part of some research that I was doing, and it's disputed. They say it's number 3 in the world, but other people say it's number 1. So it is a ridiculously densely populated area.
So you got Gaza, you got
the West Bank.
Okay.
Yeah. So Gaza, you have to picture. Gaza is like, I'm from the West Bank.
Yeah.
So when I talk about Palestine, I always say, look, I don't have it as bad as Gaza because we don't. Be honest. Gaza is that, it's the worst case scenario. It's the borders are closed. You can't get out or get in. Very few times Israel permits. In fact, I was doing some research with a friend who's he's now the director of the Human Rights Commission in Canada. He's the highest position in the Yukon Territory, so he runs the whole. And he's a huge he taught a course at Harvard called Palestine 101, and this is the course that we're basing the project I was talking about before on. So and he. I lost my train of thought there. What did you ask me? Sorry. There's just so much.
No. We were just talking about there's Gaza, then there's the West Bank, and then you were saying that West Bank doesn't have it nearly as bad as Gaza.
Right. So
you can't go in or out.
Yeah, you can't go in and out. It's closed off. They control everything. 3 years ago, the Haaretz, which is the major newspaper in Israel, they put out like a really scathing report. Gideon Levy, I don't know if you guys know him. He's a Jewish Israeli who he's now on the executive director board of the Haaretz, the major newspaper in Israel, and he's a really fair person. Like, he loves Israel, but he also says, look, we're bipolar. The Israeli country is bipolar. We're not admitting that just us living and existing is denying Palestinian existence, but we argue the opposite. We say that they're trying to deny our existence. So he put out a report and said that the military said that they want to keep Gaza on a strict diet. They want every person in Gaza to have 1,500 calories. And this is how calculated, by the way, these are. We're not talking about, don't let guns in, don't let diapers in, which they do not allow, actually. Like, baby food is not allowed because somehow you can make a bomb out of it. I don't know. That's what they say. But even strictly, they want them on a strict diet because they want to starve the population. Yeah, right? Because then how do they... 2 days ago, exactly. Yeah. 2 days ago, Human Rights said that the mother, I can't remember who it was at the UN Security Council, but she said that the same people that put out the report that said Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020, which it is, she said most mothers are feeding their kids poison, not realizing that the water is poisonous. Most mothers in Gaza, which is true.
So they don't have access to clean water?
No. Electricity, right now they're getting 3 hours a day. There's a guy on Twitter, a friend of mine actually in Gaza, he's on Twitter and he's trying to put out reports as much as possible. Yeah. Every day he puts out, okay, power's on, power's off. Power's on. So he keeps people up to date. And he said, we haven't been able to get clean water. Electricity has been very limited. So that's every day, right? It's a siege, it's a blockade. We have the flotillas that tried to go there, and the Israeli army actually attacked the flotilla. Like, they brought soldiers down from a helicopter onto the flotilla.
What was the flotilla?
So it was just like a boat that they took with medical supplies and stuff. There was a team from Turkey. There was people from the U.S. and Canada, like just human rights activists.
This was a few years ago, right? Or when was this?
This was, so the last flotilla that went was like 3-4 years ago, I think. That was the one where they boarded, the Israeli army actually boarded, and it was a big controversy because it was in international waters, so people are like, you're breaking international law, but as Palestinians, we're like, the whole country is breaking international law just by building, right? Like settlements. I don't mean Israel. I'm talking about in the occupied territory, right? Yeah. So that's where we are today, right? So from the
so that's Gaza. Like, is West Bank? You were saying is
so Gaza is.
Talk about like what when you speak about Palestine.
Yeah.
What exactly.
Yeah. So people need to. Yeah. People don't really realize like Gaza is like that closed off area. And one more thing I want to say about Gaza before I move on is like people think that Gaza is something like they think it's Hamas and everyone's like extremist Muslim and whatnot. There's like I think the population of Christians in Gaza I think by the last count was about 7,000. And every year about 300 of them apply for a permit on Easter and on Christmas to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to go to Nazareth, to go visit their holy sites. Every year they're denied. We never see this in the news. Like I think they want the narrative to be like, hey, this is Muslims, terrorists against the world. That's the narrative they want to put out. But people don't realize like the Christian population in Palestine is just as oppressed as the Muslim population. In fact, the only time I ever saw it in any media was, I think it was 3 years ago when they were denied. The Pope actually made a statement and he condemned Israel for not allowing people, because there is a law, it's bylaw 5747 in Israel that states they're not allowed to deny worshippers rights to go to their holy sites. But of course we saw, they went into the Aqsa, they tear gas, they stopped Christians. So they don't really care even about their own laws, let alone international law. And by the way, I'm not an apologist for any, like I'm going to be very harsh. Like if you want the Israeli side, interview someone else. I'm going to tell you my side. Yeah, because people, right? And that's the thing, like, I know. And it's, I don't even look at it as like, I don't look at it as bias. I just look at it as, hey man, like I've had one narrative the whole time and it's been the complete opposite of the narrative that's been in the West. And now that everyone's like, hey, you know what? This is part of this progressive movement, Black Lives Matter, indigenous rights, women's rights. I feel like Palestine is the next big issue that's coming. I've noticed it in public opinion and in the media and in like it's really changing. Yeah. So I'm hoping that it goes that way, because I do think Palestine, it is a progressive issue, right? It's not just a Muslim cause, it's not just a Palestinian cause. It's become a human rights cause, right? So so yeah, that's
So going back
sorry. I know I lose track really quick.
I do think it's important because a lot of times, especially myself included, people who are not as aware of it tends to fade into the background, the entire conflict, because it's so consistent, right? We've heard it basically our entire lives that, there's a Palestine-Israel conflict. But, it doesn't get humanized until there's actual footage on the ground that you can see. And so I think from our perspective and from the general perspective, it would be helpful to get sort of a little bit more of that contextual understanding of the entire area, right? So we hear about Gaza. We don't hear as much about the West Bank. Yeah. We really didn't hear, I personally hadn't heard much about the East Jerusalem until the Sheikh Jarrah situation that happened more recently. So how big is the West Bank? How populous is that? How big is East Jerusalem? Like, how many people are we talking about? Because, the 2 million in Gaza is a number that you start to hear more and more in kind of the reporting on the ground, more of the guerrilla media, if you will. Yeah. But not necessarily much about the West Bank or East Jerusalem. So is it all good over there? Is it,
It's not, no, definitely not. So Gaza, an open air prison is the best way to describe it. The West Bank, it's an apartheid system. And one thing that I've been trying to do, like in terms of the narrative, trying to get the narratives changed, because a lot of people think that it's so complicated and how can I ever understand it? And I tell people it's actually not that complicated. You want to know what West Bank and East Jerusalem, the situation, look at South African apartheid. That's exactly what it is. And I actually like to, I'll say it here, I don't say it in the media, because even if you say Hamas, like yesterday I had my first anti-Semitism charge on Twitter and on a couple different social media platforms, and it's really hard, honestly, to talk about it, because you like I've been to the like obviously West Bank. I used to go every 4 years because, like I said, I have a Palestinian passport, and the law was that you had to return to renew it, or you just lost it and lost your land. So we used to go every 4 years to Palestine to renew our passport. And when I go to the West Bank, like I tell people straight up, like I used to say apartheid, and they used to look at you like you're 9/11 was an inside job type guy, right? Now you say apartheid and people are like, oh yeah, actually, I read a little bit of what Chomsky said, and it is an apartheid. Like there are separate roads. There's Jews only roads, Palestinian only roads. If you look, let me go back. Why it's an apartheid? This is how it was set up. So this is supposed to be occupied land. This is what's supposed to be, okay, we have Israel, Gaza, Hamas has Gaza, And now the West Bank is for the Palestinian Authority, PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, Palestinian Authority, all these guys, right? Because remember, in Palestine, there's two rival governments. The government of Gaza, which is Hamas, okay, and then the government of West Bank, East Jerusalem. That is the Palestinian Authority led by the Prime Minister or President Mahmoud Abbas, okay? So in the West Bank,
and these are pretty disjointed territories.
Yeah, so
like geographically.
Okay, so if you look at a map, right,
Yeah.
Israel's basically everything in the middle, and this is intentional. What Zionism said is we need to push them farther and farther to the edge until they're out. So Gaza is right on the edge; it borders Egypt.
Right.
Okay, the West Bank. The reason it's called the West Bank is because it lies right on the west bank of the Jordan River. So they call it the West Bank. That's why it's called the West Bank. So it's on the border of Jordan. It's right on the west bank of the Jordan River. Gaza is here. The map looks like this. And everything in the middle is Israel.
And when you see those maps like that show the passage of time and like Israel's land just getting bigger and bigger, like how was that accomplished? Like what was the mechanism that was used to push people further to those
So remember how we talked about the different wars? Every single war they just claimed more and more and more land. And then once the wars ended, the way they did it is in the West Bank, they said this is occupied territory, but what they did is they started building settlements. So Israeli settlements, kibbutzes, if you've ever heard that term. What these are is, what people don't realize is the settlements are not in Israel. If they were, they wouldn't be against international law. International law states the occupying power is not allowed to move their population into the occupied territory. This is like if you ever hear people say, I think it's like the United Nations, it's like 249. It's one of the law. Anyways, it's the one that's cited the most. It's this one, because this is the biggest law they're breaking. The settlements are illegal. The problem for the West is that even America and the U.S.
have illegal settlements.
Yes. No, sorry. Even America and U.S. recognize that the settlements are illegal.
Okay.
This is where they have the biggest problem. Like, they can justify Israel and say, hey, they need the right to defend themselves, and God gave them this land 3,000 years ago, and all these arguments. But you'll notice the settlements are the big sticky issue that they get uncomfortable around, because by their own admittance, they're illegal, right? So that's what they're doing. They're transferring a population into the occupied territory. Okay. Now, where it gets really sticky and why it's systemic racism is because a Jewish person of Jewish heritage from anywhere in the world, it doesn't have any tie to Israel, can claim, it's a law. In Israeli law, it's called the right of return law. They can say, like, let's say an Edmontonian, let's say a guy that lives over there says, you know what, today I feel like I want to move to Israel. He is allowed by law to move to Israel, go into the West Bank and steal some. This is what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. You guys probably saw that viral clip of Jacob, the Brooklyn Jew. You could tell he's got a Brooklyn accent, and he doesn't have any tie to Israel. He literally went into Sheikh Jarrah, took over half a home for about 3 years, and now he wants to just take the whole home. The Palestinians living there, the indigenous Aboriginal Palestinians have been living there for generations. Not only do they not have the right to the home they're living in, none of their ancestors have the right of return. And whereas a Jew from anywhere in the world, right, can come and live there. This is why it's just blinding. This is, like, when we talk about systemic racism in the US, it's so hard to argue it sometimes because it's not in law. Like, Jim Crow era's done, and we can't really point to an exact law. And I'm not saying they're not oppressed, they definitely are, but it's hard to point to a law. But in Israel, it's so easy to make the argument of systemic racism. In fact, the nation-state law that came in 2017, it declared that Israel is no longer an Israeli nation, it's a Jewish nation, and the Jews will have a level of rights above everyone else on the land. And I'm quoting that from the law. That is systemic racism by definition. When you're giving rights to people strictly because of their ethnicity or their race or religion, this is systemic racism.
Or taking them away from others.
Or taking them away from others. And this is what's happening. So you have the West Bank with settlements. Settlements are always built on higher ground. They lavishly spend the resources, so they get water, electricity 24 hours a day. And in fact, even in Israeli news, you can see it in the papers, what they do is they release their sewage out into when they release it down the land, and it's always the Palestinian villages that are built downhill. So they get the sewage, they get less electricity, they have to travel on so the Jewish roads are connected, so you get everywhere quick. The Palestinian roads are disjointed, and there's a checkpoint every so often where they have to stop, and there's so many things that you can point to that are like, that's exactly what South African apartheid.
And there was also something I read about like a different legal system. So like an Israeli Jewish person committing a crime versus a Palestinian committing a crime are kind of subject to two different.
100%. Everything, like when you read the nation state law, it's in the law. It says there's a complete separate level of rights and legal, legal rights for everyone, not just Palestinians, by the way. Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, and a term that is becoming popular now that no one realizes, Palestinian Jews. There's a lot of Jews that live in Palestine. Like the biggest city in the West Bank is called Nablus. And if you ever seen that knafa, the red knafa, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's from Nablus. That's the original place. That's why they call it Nabulsi knafa. It's like the most famous dessert of the Palestinians. That Nablus is the biggest city in the West Bank. They have a group of Jews that live there, Samaria they're called, probably 3,000 to 5,000 Jews that refuse, like they don't even recognize Israel as a country. And it's based on their religious reading of the text. They say like, we're not allowed to even enter the land of Israel until the Messiah comes back. And I had actually a conversation with one of them, and he told me, you know how you Muslims, you say kuffar, like kafir is a non-Muslim, someone who's left Islam? He's like, we consider the Jews in Israel as kafirs. They're not real Jews because they're not following the law, right? It's so interesting. Like if you want to get into that dynamic, the Old Testament, the Torah does say that they're not allowed to enter, not Israel, but Jerusalem until the Messiah returns. So these guys say that these guys are kafir because what they're saying is Jesus is the Messiah. He's returned, we can go there. But they don't believe that, right? Like, so Muslims and Christians both believe Jesus was the Messiah. Christians believe he's already come. We believe he'll come in the Day of Judgment. Jews don't believe that at all. They believe he's the imposter and the real Messiah is coming later. So they say to the Jews in Israel, you guys went against the book because you know. And the interesting thing about that is most of Israel is a secular state anyways. Like Netanyahu doesn't eat kosher meat. I don't know if anyone knows that. The Knesset, the parliament in Israel, they sit on a Saturday. They don't recognize the Sabbath. So to say it's a religious thing, like that's why I'm like, I was on the Ryan Jesperson show, I don't know if you guys know, and he kind of like said like, you know, I've been friends with him for a while, we keep up, you know, and he said to me, he's like, you know, every time I talk to you, it seems like you're a religious guy. I said, I'm not denying religion. I'm religious. I pray 5 times a day. I love my religion. You know, my relationship with my Creator is so important to me. But in the Palestine question, I never make the religious argument. It's a logical fallacy, right? It's called arguing from authority. You say God gave it to me in my book, right? I say God gave it to me in my book. Christian says God gave it to me. All of a sudden, like, you can't. Arguing from authority doesn't work because I don't believe in your authority. Let's be honest, most of society now, like atheism is growing. Most people don't believe in, even if they're spiritual, they don't believe God's a real estate agent. He doesn't go around saying this land is, you know what I mean? Like, that's why it's just, to me, it's such a ridiculous argument to make. Whether you're a Muslim or non-Muslim, whatever you are, the religious argument, we have to keep it on the side. Right? So there's a lot of dynamics. I know I talk in circles.
No.
There's so much to. And thank you for sharing. Like clearly you're so well versed in this topic, and it's so wonderful to have that much knowledge, because I think it's like people don't know, right? And like you were saying, like the change in social media of now no longer getting things through from only one source, or like only through the media who, you know, have a certain perspective and that's the only thing you hear. Like we're now through this have such access to these, what the reality is on the ground, and I think that's what's changing people's minds and thoughts now, and why people are being like, okay, like I mean I know for me and the people in my life, like it's very much like I'm watching this and it's like I can't deny what I'm seeing. Like I can't not have an opinion. I can't be like, this is complicated. Like it is complicated, but the reality of what's happening on the ground, it's like you kind of, it's such a help to, I think, educate people. And you were saying that like that social media kind of getting info from Gaza when they have their internet and access and stuff and getting things is changing the movement, probably because it can be so much more far reaching. Yeah,
100%. I mean, the social media aspect alone has been like, it's just blown everything out. Like all of these old paradigms and these outdated cliche things that people say, like, oh, if only Palestinians loved their children more than they hated Jews. And it's like, man, like you can see videos on the ground of Palestinians and Jews working together in Palestine doing projects. Like it's so cartoonish. It's like when I think about Bush as like cowboy diplomacy, like with us or against us, pew pew pew. Like that's the image that we've had of Palestine. It's like, and now it's so different.
The one thing that I did want to touch on, going back to what you were saying about how this is being painted in many lights as a religious conflict, when in reality, I mean, the second you start to take that position, it just becomes a massive fallacy, and it truly is not a religious conflict on the ground, right? It becomes a human rights conflict. The one thing that I found interesting more than anything, maybe you can shed some more light on this, is the fact that when you look at the massive the major donors, if you will, of the Zionist movement, of the Israeli kind of pro-Israeli movement that's happening, it's not always the case that it is sort of the American Jewish community. In fact, the evangelical Christian community is the one which tends to be the heaviest donors. So do you have any understanding of the context behind that?
Yeah, so it's funny you should mention that, because 4 days ago, the guy who used to be the ambassador from Washington to Israel, he wrote an article in the Times of Israel, again, a major newspaper in Israel. They're a little bit more right-leaning than Haaretz, which is the biggest newspaper, but still a very recognized newspaper in Israel. He actually wrote an article saying we need to give up on American Jews, because he said our biggest critics right now are American Jews, and they're the millennials and younger. So he said if we want the future of Israel, we need to really focus our money and our energy on exactly what you said, evangelical Christians, because these are the ones that are supporting us most. They've lost Jewish support, and they're admitting it. Like I said, he published this in the Time of Israel, which is a little bit shocking, but also shows that the times are changing. Public opinion is changing. So I agree with you. That's an amazing point, and I think more people need to know that to get us away from this religious argument, right? Like I've always had, my life's always been weird in terms of the religious sense, because as you know, my father, and it's funny, we have a link because my father taught you Quran, right? And growing up, my father was the first principal of the Edmonton Islamic Academy when they were just operating out of the mosque. And he was a very religious guy, but a very fair kind of religious guy. Like, he wasn't one of those guys that's like, just pray and don't do anything else, right? He's like, no, you have your duty to God and your duty to man, and you need to do both. And so I went to Catholic school my whole life. And as a kid, I didn't understand it. And people they'd say, man, your dad's the principal of the Islamic school and you're going to Catholic school, what's your deal, right? So I grew up, for better or for worse, all of my friends, I didn't have Arab friends growing up. Even to this day, most of my friends are white, Catholic. The way I describe it is clean-cut white boys. I played basketball, high school basketball, men's league basketball. I don't want to give the Arab in the north side a bad name, but where I grew up in Dickinsfield. We were in the projects, Edmonton housing. We didn't have a lot of money, so subsidized housing. So all our neighbors were the drug dealers of the north side and stuff like that. And I just really didn't like that atmosphere, so I kind of hung out with the West End. I went to St. Francis Xavier for high school, St. Thomas More. So religion's always been a big thing, and I've always been really interested in comparative religion. And I found it very interesting how, especially with the Palestine thing, people are not honest with themselves about the religious thing. It's just like you said, it really isn't a religious. You can't make the religious argument anymore, because it gets you'll always get to the point where, okay, well, you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. Mm-hmm. We're not going to solve the problem.
Agree,
right?
to disagree, we
disagree.
can't move
and
forward.
When we talked about, it's a logical fallacy. To argue from authority, you cannot do that, because your authority is not the authority I recognize, right? And so we always find ourselves trapped when we make that argument. But I also think it's important not to deny the religious aspect as well, because a lot of times on the radio this last week, I had a huge platform, right? Everybody wanted to interview us on the Palestinian cause. Everybody wanted to know. So we told them, look, there is a religious link. Yeah, to these people, the night they went into Al-Aqsa was the 27th of Ramadan, which is most likely Laylatul Qadr. So it's literally the holiest night of the holiest month of the holiest year, right? And I explained it to the media, even if you're not religious, think of a time in your life when you felt most at one with the universe. You felt the most spiritual, whether you're religious or not. If you're not religious, find a time where you thought the universe aligned, or whatever you feel. That's what we feel on Laylatul Qadr. It's your highest moment. People are really their connection to their creator is really strong. Then all of a sudden you have these guys bashing through the doors of the holiest place in the world, one of the holiest places in the world to you, firing stun grenades, tear gas. People lost their sight. People lost their limbs. They didn't even report that in the news. In the Israeli news, it was reported, but not here. It was a really bad. It wasn't just knocking on the door and, hey, we think Hamas has things here. No, they just broke in. It was a provocation, right? So there is that religious aspect. And you have to recognize it, right? For all sides, Jews, Christians, Muslims. But you also have to admit that it's been a long time since this was a religious war. A long time. Like Yasser Arafat wasn't that religious a guy. And he is the Palestinian guy, right? He took it from like a revolutionary perspective. What he did actually is he took the Palestinian plight and put it on a world stage. That was the biggest thing he did for the Palestinians.
So two things on that, right?
Yeah.
One from the Muslim angle and then one from the Jewish angle.
Yeah.
I guess my question on the Muslim side is: do you think because it's not considered on a kind of geopolitical scale, it's not considered a quote unquote like religious battle? Do you think that gives neighboring Arab countries, a reason not to support the plight, or is there something else at play? And then on the flip side, do you think why do you maybe it's just strictly due to like easy ammunition, but the idea of Zionism and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism being so closely linked together, is that just a talking point and therefore propaganda for the Israeli state? And a tool that's being utilized to basically say, oh, if you're anti-Israel, therefore you're anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. So there's two pretty big questions there. So I'll let you go.
So the first one, it's funny. Like this last 2 weeks, I've been really, really trying to like at night. I stay up for hours just thinking about stuff that I'm like, okay, there's no media around. I'm going to think about this really honestly with myself. And like I said, I trust you guys, so I wouldn't say this in the media. But I was really thinking like a lot of people in the Arab community, they despise the leaders. Like they spit. I spit on your grave, and like they curse against them. Like they really hate them because to them it's like, man, nobody's fighting for the Palestinians. At the very least, let's from a Muslim perspective, let's just unite from a Muslim perspective. Nobody's helping them. And I thought really deeply on this issue, and I thought like again, not that it's a good thing, but for better or for worse. Israel, when it was first created, the idea for America, forget the Zionist argument, for America was, look, we have a foothold in the Middle East, that we can control the geopolitics of the area.
Strategic military base, basically.
Right, a military base, a huge military base. I thought about this the other day, and I thought, like, maybe it's bad for Islam, but for the Palestinian cause, think about this. Now, Israel's become a liability because before you needed to control Saudi and UAE and Egypt, because not that they're enemies, but you don't know what they're up to. Now that, like, Saudi said there are military troops on the ground, American military troops in Saudi. There are test sites for weapons in the UAE. They both have deals with Israel. So now I'm thinking like, wow, maybe it's bad because Muslims don't like that. Obviously, we don't want you buying Mecca and Medina, right? But from a non-Muslim perspective, think about it. Israel now becomes a liability. We have to give these guys, America gives them $3.2 billion just in military foreign aid every single year without question. It's what's called, there's a term in the geopolitics of the area, a no strings attached contract. So if you bomb Gaza, if you commit a war crime, you're still getting the 3.2 billion. After that, we'll see. Like if you saw Biden
3.4,
then maybe don't kill as many children. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I don't know if you guys saw, but Biden 5-6 days ago just signed $750 million more and told them that I'll 100% replenish the Iron Dome. They have this thing in Israel called Iron Dome.
We'll touch on that.
Yeah. So he replenished that. So I mean, it's bad. Again, like we can only have these conversations in certain circles. No, we don't want America buying Mecca and Medina and buying the Emirates. But for the Palestinian cause, what it does is it makes Israel becomes a liability. Hey man, we can control them through Saudi. Now we can control them through here. Why do we need Israel anymore, right? And this is where Israel's starting to get scared, starting to say to the US like, no, you really need us. And we'll touch on it later, but I don't know if people realize like this argument, the only real argument left is Israel's defending itself. They're really pushing that hard because like I said, there is a law in the US that says you cannot sell weapons to a country that you think is committing human rights or for offensive purposes. So if any lawmaker doesn't say that it's defensive, they're admitting to a war crime. That's why they really need to push this narrative of defense, right? And again, I'll get into that later because it's a really tough argument for them to make anymore. Because as an occupying power, by international law, you can't claim defense. Just by you being there, it's an offensive posture and it's a declaration of war. People don't realize when I talk about occupied territories, we're talking about soldiers on the ground in military gear with guns at checkpoints every few kilometers. You're living in a military zone. So it's almost a ridiculous thing to claim defense, right? And I quoted it on my Facebook yesterday. It was the first time I actually made a quote from me. Usually I just like to post rallies and stuff. Hanan Ashrawi, who was like probably the most recognized female in the Palestinian liberation movement, and she was the official spokesperson under Yasser Arafat for so long. She said, Palestinian people are the only people in the world that are asked to guarantee to the security of their occupier, and Israel is the only country in the world that claims defense from its victims. And this is exactly what's happening today, right? It's a beautiful quote that sums it all up, right? So that's that issue. Now the anti-Semitism issue.
But
sorry,
just to kind of wrap that up,
keep
though,
going.
right?
Yeah,
As it relates to those other nations, though, do you think that they are taking that stance that this is not a Muslim cause, therefore we aren't getting involved, we don't want to get our hands dirty? Like, why isn't Jordan and Egypt and Saudi and the UAE, like, why is there's no kind of feeling of responsibility for the people in that region?
You know what? I wish I knew that answer, because that's something that lots of my non-Muslim friends ask me, and they say, man, like, why aren't the Muslim countries, like, you have some strong militaries in the Middle East.
Like surrounding. Like very geographically well positioned.
The only thing I can think of is, let's be honest, it's still political suicide to support Palestine. It's becoming more mainstream in the public, even in the media.
But like that's very recent.
It's political suicide for the reasons you said. You're labeled an anti-Semitism almost immediately. Right? But the Muslim countries, you're right. And actually, if you start listening to what the ulama are saying, the religious scholars, they're actually, a lot of them are starting to divide on this issue. Now, even on Facebook, even in this community, you know Khalid Hossi? And you might know him. He's the guy that puts out all when someone passes away on. He's linked the Islam 101 newsletter. That's his, and so he does a lot of things. But he posted a thing saying, if every khutbah this Jum'ah is not about Palestine, then shame on all our ulama. So many hardcore Muslims, like I would call them Salafis and these kind of guys. This is what's wrong with you guys. You guys think Palestine is no. Learn your deen first. Learn Aqidah first. Who cares about Palestine? It's not even an important thing Islamically. You should pray first before going to these protests. There's mixing of people at these protests. There's non-Muslims. And I'm like, man, do you eat at Boston Pizza? Because there's mixing of men and women at Boston Pizza. You're okay with that, but you don't want to stand up for human rights. You know what I mean? Like, there is a deep divide, and this is happening on the bigger scale. So Saudi, UAE, they're doing exactly what you said they're doing. They're saying this is not a religious fight. They're trying to pull the religion out of it. That's why when I speak, I'm very careful to say it's not a religious. If you've noticed in interviews what I say, this is not a religious war in the way that Israel reacts. Because there are religious aspects. I don't want to take that away, because if you take that away, then like you said, you absolve the Muslim countries.
And it's not a religious war in the sense that only Muslim countries therefore have a responsibility to stop it.
And that's the danger, exactly, of making it not religious at all, because then, So that's complicated. The other thing too is, like, I mean, I've been around a lot of old, angry Arab guys. And they're, for better or for worse, like, I would never want them sitting and talking to a group of my friends, because I know what they mean when they say the Jew stole my homeland, but they don't understand, like, just using the word the Jew like an archetype rather than Jewish people, or the Jew like as an archetype, that is violently anti-Semitic. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can't say that.
Yeah.
So I'll say to my father-in-law, like, please, when my buddies are here, maybe use the word Zionist, maybe you know what I mean? That's not, but when you say the Jew, like, you're taking a whole people, and you know what I mean? Like,
and equating them with,
sounds so bad. So that's very important. Like, people don't realize the power of words. Like, we talk about it like it's like a cliche type of thing. No, it's a real. Like, one word you say could turn someone completely off your cause. They'll never look into your cause again. Right. So we have to be very careful with that kind of thing.
Like, so, and sorry but just like that equation of like anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, when you do see that actually happen, because like unfortunately a lot of people will use this movement to express their anti-Semitic views and stuff, and it hurts the movement. Like, it devalues it, and you can't fix oppression with oppression. Like, that's not going to work. 100%. And so it's like how what do you do in a situation when there is somebody, because I think number one, we need to differentiate between them and make that extremely clear, that like anti-Semitism has no place in this movement. That is not what we're about. It is anti-Zionism, it is anti-colonialism, it is anti-oppression, anti-apartheid, all that. And those are different things. And so I think number one is the separation, but then number two is like when someone does that. And I think it's really frustrating too, because there was on last Saturday when we did the big driving rally here in Edmonton, there was what I would call a hate crime against a Jew. Was it a family home or a business? I don't remember. It was a family home, and they kind of spray painted like "Free Palestine" and like something, and it was unfortunate because while I know that none of the activists who were at the driving rally supporting Palestine would have gone and done that to a Jewish family home, like that, I don't know. Yeah. The media immediately linked it, and even though there was like barely any coverage of the driving rally, which is also problematic in and of itself, there was there was this immediate link of like there was a pro-Palestine rally going on today, and this anti-Semitic thing happened in the city, and those two things are linked. Exactly. And so it's like even if they're not, like the narrative is gonna put those two things together. And so like, what do you do?
So that was the day that happened. What happened in the city locally was the Edmonton police on their official social media put out a thing saying there was an anti-Semitic remark. They said kind of a little bit, and then they said the person that did it yelled "Free Palestine" and drove away. Right. And then they said we have no evidence that this is linked to the car rally. So myself and a couple other people that respond to the media and to the police,
why did you put that in your
We said, you guys admitted in the post that there's no evidence, so why would you do that to put our community at risk, right? Yeah. And I know deep down, sometimes honestly, and I don't want to give people the benefit of the doubt that don't deserve it, but this Palestine-Israel issue, there is so much indoctrination that people don't even realize they're indoctrinated, right?
On both sides.
On both sides.
100%.
On both sides. Because, you know, I talk to Palestinians, they're like, oh, look at they never cover us, they never do this. I said, guys, it's changing. Look at public opinion. No, they have so much control over the media and this and that, which I used to buy that when I was young. I don't buy it anymore because I've been to Israel and I've seen like people in my community always say, oh, the Jews are so united. They're so united on everything. No, they're not, man. No, they're not. The LGBTQ community is having a really hard time in Israel right now. They're trying to put a law in that's banning Ethiopian Jews or any black Jews from the area to come into Israel. They're trying to actually make it law right now. They're having such a huge problem. Orthodox Jews and secular Jews, almost nightly there's protests and arrests every night in Israel. So if you
and this is within Israel.
This is within Israel alone, right? And I've only mentioned 5 out of the probably 15 different groups that are fighting in Israel. So they're divided. Like we can't keep hiding behind, well, they're too strong, so let's
and
give
this
up.
Idea of like conscious defectors from the IDF and like all this stuff, like there are people, whether in Israel or not, who are like, this is not okay.
There's a movement right now called Breaking the Silence. I'm hoping to bring them to Edmonton as part of another group that I work with. 95 former IDF soldiers. They're up to 95 now and they're growing every day. Basically IDF, former Israeli Defense Forces, that are saying we give up, like the state of Israel it's the worst, we can't support it, and they're speaking out. So there's a lot of disunity. But to go back to the anti-Semitism thing, 2 days ago, once that thing happened, that's when like every interview, the first thing they would tell me is, well, anti-Semitism, address it. And my issue is, again, like I said, I'm not a credentialed guy. I don't have a degree in poli-sci in the area and stuff. So
you could have fooled us, though.
What's that?
You could have fooled us.
No. But the problem with that is that, like, everybody in my community comes up to me and said, like, the current president of the Canada Palestine Cultural Association thinks I should address anti-Semitism one way. My close friend Assam Saleh, who's very active in the community, thinks another way. So people are saying, do it this way. And I understand it because they're so scared. Like, once you get that label of anti-Semitism, you cannot take that off no matter what.
And then the movement would suffer, and like, who knows if it could recover, because like, like rightfully so, like it's not cool.
%. And there's a number of ways. Like, some people think we should be soft and say, we don't condone anti-Semitism, but Islamophobia is happening, black kids. My personal opinion is I don't like that approach. Let's be honest. As a Muslim, I don't have a choice. It's haram to be against Jews because they're Jews. I can't do it. But even put that aside, as a Palestinian, if you link anti-Semitism with Israel, like some people want to, number one, it's bad for Palestinians, obviously, because we can't speak out. The only form of resistance we have is now gone. And for Jews, it's bad too, because as Jews, you don't want people who are mad at the government of Israel to blame all Jews, because then you get ignorant people like that guy going and doing things at the houses. So my big thing in the media is, do not, yesterday when she asked me point blank, and I like that they went live. They went live on CTV, so I was like, oh, that's perfect. They can't edit this. Yeah. She told me straight up, she said what you said. We know that anti-Semitism is on the rise. It's happened in our community. I said, listen, as organizers here, we condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms, all the time, full stop, period. But I also want people to know that's not what we're doing here today. That's not what this movement is about. And I would encourage people to let's not link criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, because it's bad for Palestinians, it's bad for Muslims, it's bad for Jews, it's bad for humanity. And then she was like, I don't think she expected me to kind of, and literally she stopped the interview there and went on.
Wow.
I was worried they wouldn't air it, but they aired it, and it came off nice, because I wasn't saying like, yeah, anti-Semitism is bad, but we're suffering too, right? Because I don't like that approach. Let's be honest, right?
It's a very all lives matter situation.
It is,
where
and
you're
that's
just
what people were telling me. Don't be all lives matter, right? Like, it's legitimate, and we should stand up for it. If there's anti-Semitism, if there's hate towards anyone, I don't want to see it, no matter what. But let's not link that to what's happening here.
Yeah.
These protests have nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and if you want it for anti-Semitism, get lost. I don't want you in our movement.
Get out,
right?
yeah.
So we have to be clear on that, and it's becoming easy because they are starting to break that. You can start to criticize Israel now, so long as you're careful in how you do it, and again, don't use Jew as much as Zionist, because honestly, it's not Jews I have a problem with. Like I said, Nablus has a huge, thriving Jewish population that are Palestinian Jews. Yesterday, I said it to a person that's Palestinian, and they're like, that seems weird. What do you mean by that? I said, think about it. Palestinian is an ethnicity and race. Judaism is a religion. So what aren't you understanding? There's Palestinian Christian, someone who lives in the country of Palestine that follows Christianity. Then you have someone who lives in Palestine that follows Judaism, right? So that's what it is. There's Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and atheists. By the way, there's a huge movement called it's a party called the People of the Land, Shab al-Ard or something like that, and they're just like I don't want to say atheists. They're like a humanitarian,
Like secular,
not exactly.
Yeah.
So there's space for all of these people, right?
Right.
So
Right. It is interesting though, because I mean, we touch on this idea of like the all lives matter type of a stance that a lot of people have started to take on this, and you do notice it. I mean, I agree with both of you guys that social media has obviously opened the eyes of a lot of people, but it does tend to still be somewhat siloed, at least in my very kind of anecdotal view of things, and just recognizing even within social media, right, where you've got a very large contingent of what I would consider pretty progressive people that I interact with on a daily basis from all different faiths and backgrounds, who are very, very pro Black Lives Matter, very very much pro Indigenous rights, very pro LGBTQ2+, all the different movements that you would expect them to be a part of. But on this one, for whatever reason, they've decided to still be a little bit on the sidelines, right? And if they do want to make a stance, it's very much, we hate to see crimes happening on both sides of the fence, right? And so, I'm assuming it's still because of this idea that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, and nobody wants to take that risk or that stance. But what could we do as people who want to create more awareness of the human rights complaint? Right, the human rights issue, the very real issue that's happening on the ground. What more, or what better could we do to make people aware of the fact that this is not a religious battle. This is not a situation where we're saying, the Jews are wrong. This is a situation where we're saying the oppressive government that is currently in power in Israel is wrong. Similarly to how we will openly criticize the Saudi government on attacks in Yemen, for example, right? Like, how do we make that parallel? Or is that parallel just not one that is digestible still in mainstream media because of, power politics or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, man. That's the crux of this thing, right, in terms of how do we move forward, right? So,
and it's also the crux of the information war, that's happening, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think, so again, I talk about, I tell people, there's an indoctrination. Everyone's indoctrinated in a certain way. And the whole point of indoctrination is you don't realize you're being indoctrinated, right? Like, for you to say I'm not biased, I understand, that's not indoctrination. Indoctrination means that you don't realize you're being indoctrinated. So there are things like this whole thing with Israel, I think, is a very deep indoctrination, because they've somehow convinced everyone that on all these issues you can be very one-sided, but on Palestine you can't. You have to admit both sides are suffering equally. Right. There's a movement in the U.S. in the Democratic Party called PBP, Progressive But Palestine. So they're saying everyone, and these are the guys, they actually went after AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They actually went out after her on this, and basically they were saying yes, we want to be progressive on all the issues except, and they're admitting it. They're said progressive but Palestine, because they do have arguments. I'm not going to defend them, but they'll tell you things like, well, Gaza is all Hamas, and if you're a gay person supporting Palestine, let's see how you fare in Hamas, right? But I mean, it's an unfair argument because you're taking the extreme. I could say, well, let's see how you fare in Orthodox Israel, where they have the same, you know what I mean?
Right.
So it's a deep indoctrination. I think the solution, and this is my personal opinion, is we need to stop taking one approach, which is what we've been doing for 73 years. And this is my issue with like making dua against people, for example. I mean, come on, guys, we've been making dua against them for 73 years and it hasn't worked. Maybe make dua for them. Let's try that, maybe, That's the religious perspective. But the other thing that I think the Muslims, because of the evolution of Muslims in this country, we're now at a point where we have people that are doing progressive things, like this podcast. 10 years ago, our parents' generation, they just wanted to work, put their heads down, avoid authority, don't get in trouble. We're now at the point where we're like, no, I pay taxes like everyone else. I want my rights. My dad would have said, no, just do good in school and don't bother anyone. You know what I mean? We're now at the point where we're like, I don't want to say like in a cocky way, but we're like, hey man, I contribute as much to the arts scene, to the academic scene, to this. We have Muslim doctors, Muslim lawyers, artists, rappers, everything. So this is the approach I think that we need to change. For so long they were saying, you want freedom for Palestine? Pray, make dua, send money, donation, or fight. Those were your only options. Now it's like, no man, like Bella and Gigi Hadid are speaking out, right? And my kids asked me the other day, and I had to really think about it, right? Like, I want my kids to have Islamic values, and they're very kind of sheltered. They go to Islamic school, and even my kids are like, why are all your friends white boys? Like, you don't even have like a lot of, they ask me that sometimes, like jokingly, right? And I told them, like, my one son who's like Islamic school upbringing, Gigi Hadid spoke up for Palestine, but look how she dresses, right? And so I said, listen, you don't agree with what she does, like how she dresses or whatever, fine. I'm not going to say right or wrong. That's not my position. My position is, look, she's willing to help you. Let's not criticize. Like, there's a hadith that says every single person is responsible for Islam from their angle. Whether it's if you're a journalist or a this or a that, don't let your angle that you're fighting, don't let the defense from your angle fall. I believe that's how we have to approach it, right? So if you have someone that's good in the arts, let him fight for Palestinian cause from the artistic perspective. You have filmmakers that are now putting out, there's a movie that came out, it's 2021, it won the BAFTA award for best short film. It actually was nominated for an Academy. I don't know if it won. I think the Academy Awards were April 23rd or something. So it's called The Present. You can watch it on Netflix. Amazing movie. And it's the opening scene is actually, they're at an actual checkpoint. It's live. The only fictional character is the main character. Everyone else at that checkpoint is actually trying to go to work and whatnot. So it's a really good, that's the kind of stuff. Put out movies, put out podcasts, let athletes speak about it and support them. Whether you think they're a good athlete or a good Muslim, whatever it is, support them. We need to attack the Palestine issue. See, even words like attack, I don't like to use them. Here I will, but in the media, they'll take that and say, oh, look at the words, fight, attack. But anyways, we need to attack it from all angles. And I think that's the only way. Social media, the youth is a huge thing, right? Because now, let's be honest, like guys like me, my expiry is almost done in terms of being super active, right, in the community. People are going to stop listening to me. They want to hear the 18-year-old, the 25-year-old. So we need to pass that on to the youth, and we need to make the youth understand that it's okay to fight whatever way you want. We're not going to criticize it. If you want to do an underground rap battle, even if I don't agree because whatever, guys are smoking weed or people are mixing, fine, religiously I can disagree with that. But let them move the cause forward, right? And I say that, and a lot of people will disagree with me, and that's fine. Muslims will say, no man, you have to do this straight by the book, or else it's not a cause worth fighting for. That's your opinion, fine. I'm telling you my personal opinion. We need to hit it from all angles, right? Yeah. And it's the same thing with Mosquers. I remember when you guys had, I don't know if you're okay with me bringing this up.
Please do, no. Yeah.
So at the Mosquers, the first year you guys had the popcorn after party,
we got
right?
So much
right, there was a lot, and I heard it on my side. A lot of heat from people saying, "Oh, what are you guys doing? It's a halal nightclub that you're doing, and all this stuff." And I was like, "Why do you hate it so much? If you're against it, fine. But do you realize? Like, I went to it, I was blown away by How many Muslims in the city? I didn't know.
Exactly.
And I pride myself on knowing a lot of people in the city. Like I have a lot of different groups that I'm part of, and I feel like I know most groups. And I loved what it did because it brought Muslims that thought like, my Islam isn't acceptable in the mainstream, so I'm not going to contribute to the mainstream.
100%.
You guys brought all these people together. We had artists, we had fashion experts, we had... It opened my eyes. Like at Popcorn, I was like, my God, what a vibrant Muslim community we have, right? Yeah. That's where I think the Palestinian cause needs to go. Open up these channels and these doors for people who have a skill that they don't think might work in this cause, and show them, yeah, it does, man. Even if you're just good at drawing, draw as much stuff on Palestine and put it out there, right? So that's where I think.
Well, and to build on that point, right? And we've been talking about this off camera quite a bit about how the idea of the arts being both a tool, as well as a way in which you can amplify the message of what's going on right now, but also recognizing that this is not a situation whereby the Palestinian artistic world and the culture of Palestine is not something that is just recent, nor is it something that we can only now utilize as a tool. I mean, I would assume, but maybe you can provide more context, that there is probably a very rich history of arts in Palestine that we just don't get exposed to, because when we think of Palestine, we think of it from a more conflict perspective of some kid on the street throwing a rock, and unfortunately that is sort of the image that we've been brought up to see. But do you have any understanding of what the Palestinian artistic I mean, at the end of the day, we are a podcast that looks to shine a light on sort of the artistic expression. Do you have any sort of an understanding of that?
For sure. I think, when you look historically at the arts and stuff, think of Superman and all these things, right? Like Siegel and Schultz, I think, were the two guys. They created Superman as a way for the Jews that were living in the ghettos, right? Like if you read the first ones, they were all, the bad guy was always the Nazis, right? And Superman was always, it came out of like they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Mm-hmm. It was a necessity. They needed somewhere to vent. Like there was no mental health at the time. Their mental health therapy was Superman. Oh, he could save us, right? This is what's happening in Palestine now. Because there's so much oppression, people are finding ways to vent. Like I said, there's an underground battle rap scene. And if you listen to them, a lot of their battle rap's political, right? Like we've been suffering, and there's a lot of really good one-liners and stuff that are coming out. The art community is thriving. Like I'm talking about visual arts. Right. If you look the wall, the separation wall. Yeah. I don't know if you guys have seen. There's tons of graffiti artists from all over, Banksy. Yeah, of course. Yeah, Banksy has I think 6 or 7 pieces. Yeah. And
he did that hotel.
So he has the hotel that boasts the worst view in the world. Yeah. It's actually facing the separation wall, right? You can go stay in that it's his hotel. He owns it, right? Wow. Obviously he's anonymous, right? No one knows who Banksy really is, but he's a very pro-Palestinian. And from him, you now have a group of anonymous Palestinians that are drawing on the wall. Because obviously, if you draw on the wall and they know who you are, you're getting arrested in Israel, right? Right. So we have a thriving community that's trying to make the separation wall one big piece of graffiti, right? Mm-hmm. Recently somebody drew a big Trump thing. Someone did a Rick and Morty, an homage to Rick and Morty, which was really cool. There's a lot of cool stuff. There's the very famous one of the girl with the balloons floating in the air. There's a lot of them that are it's as if there's a window open up and you can see trees, that kind of art. So the art scene is thriving out of necessity. People are so oppressed, they need a mental vent, I guess, or something. I've heard people describe it as it's a cathartic type of thing for them, right? The whole art scene is like that. So you have let's not forget Belly. Belly's Palestinian. A lot of people have no Belly the rapper. He's probably the most famous Palestinian rapper, right? He did the most famous song is
with Genuine, right?
What's that?
Isn't it with Genuine, the song?
Yeah, he did.
Belly Feet Genuine. That's
that's right.
I'm trying to think of the name of the song.
Yeah, and he's I might not make it. He did with so there's and he's unapologetically Palestinian. He throws down. Sometimes he'll do just what do they call it? Just when they freestyle. And it's all Palestine, he's Palestine. So there's that. There's, like I said, movies. Right now there's a lot of really good filmmakers that are coming out of Palestine, telling the stories. Because now that they can tell their stories, they're thriving. There's things we never see. when Gaza was bombed in 2014, I think it was, they hit the zoo. Israel hit the zoo and they destroyed it.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of artists and Palestinians, they wanted the kids to still live a life, right? So what they did is they took a bunch of horses, they painted one horse to look like a zebra, right? They painted one horse to look like a cougar. Like they had all these things, and like it's so creative. When you think about it, you're like, wow, like I would have never thought of that. Like I'm picking up rubble from my home, but these guys are thinking about the mental health of these kids and how to kind of, contribute to it. So there's a lot of the artistic community in Palestine is thriving, and I think it will become more mainstream once social media starts putting it out there more. Because like I said before, like honestly, like the best ideas come out of necessity. When you're really like trapped and you want to vent and you put it down on paper or in a song or on visual art, and so it is growing. Like there's a huge community in the art community in Palestine.
Well, and plus, like I mean, we might not have specific examples here right now, but the idea that Israel was born amongst land that was uninhabited or didn't already have an existing cultural or probably a substantial art scene at the time is a complete farce as well, right? Like there was, Palestine had a flourishing culture prior to 1948 and prior to all the different accords and so on and so forth, right? And I think that's an artistic history that might have already been lost, if not something that is like grasping to be preserved and to be grown upon.
Yeah, I wish I knew. Like I remember my dad talking about really famous Palestinian artists and singers and stuff. I don't know them. Like my generation, it's been lost. You're right, a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, you probably don't know them because of the fact that they've been buried.
Overshadowed by war and
completely.
The big thing in Israel is they say a land for a people a land without people for a people without land. That's their motto. And you're right. It's. I mean, there's so much. Like I just yesterday. A guy came up to me, non-Muslim, non-Palestinian, and he had a coin that he bought at an auction, 1927, Palestine. It said on it, Palestine, land of Palestine. So people who say, there was no Palestine before Israel, I mean, there's physical evidence out there, right? That it's just a lie, a blatant lie.
Even there's like been some pictures circulating on social media of like full-on streets with like theaters and like cars and like all this stuff, and you're like, where have these been? Like my only visions of Palestine are like pictures of like Gaza and the West Bank and stuff like that, and it's like, obviously that's a different conversation than that you're having about that photo. And nobody talks about like this was a place before, like this was a home to so many people who now can't return back. And sorry, are you done? Because I have like I'm gonna take us in a different direction. Go ahead. So
just let me close by saying
yes, please.
At one time we call it in Arabic, they call it Bilad al-Sham. In English, I think they call it the Levant. Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon were all one. You didn't need a passport to pass through them. And as you know, they used to call Lebanon the Paris of the Middle East. The reason they did that is because their theater and their music industry was tops in the world. And this was Palestine. This was where it grew out of, right? So there is a thriving community. There was in the past. I think it would be a great thesis for someone as a PhD in political science, honestly, to focus on the arts community before the war started.
Yeah.
Right.
But so I just wanted to finish.
Well, I want to touch on like, we should have talked about this before the art stuff, but I just wanted to talk about like the whole two sides argument and how it's like there's this idea, like, so right now, currently, there is a ceasefire, and I have a couple of problems with calling it a ceasefire, because that implies, like, a two-sided agreement, like, two sides that are actually being affected the same, who are agreeing to, like, both stop doing the same thing, whereas this is such a one-sided thing that, like, I don't think the term fits appropriately. And also, like, everyone's like, oh, look, like, Israel agreed to peace, like, there's a ceasefire, like, look at this wonderful thing, even after all these deaths and all of this stuff. But it's like stuff is still happening. Like the ceasefire is not when someone says ceasefire, I'm like, this fighting has stopped, the pain has stopped. Like there's currently none of that happening, and that's really not true. Like there's still homes being invaded and still people being arrested and people being assaulted and stuff. So what's the situation now that's there?
Like when I talk about it, I like to, my approach now in the media is I start with Sheikh Jarrah because that's what started all this, and I prove the point that it's ethnic cleansing. Any Jew from anywhere in the world, and actually since 2014, you don't even have to, you can just marry into a Jewish family and still get those same rights. Any Jew from anywhere in the world can go to Sheikh Jarrah and take the home of an indigenous population that's been there for generations.
And this is in East Jerusalem?
This is in East Jerusalem. Yes, occupied East. In fact, anywhere in the West Bank, right? Because settlements are being built all over, right? So that I haven't, to date, and this is why I think public opinion is changing, no one's called me out on that and said, well, no, that's not actually ethnic cleansing by definition. Even the staunchest supporters of Israel, at least I haven't heard it, they don't argue that. So you say that. Then I go into the apartheid. Separate roads for separate people. Mandela was called a terrorist, thrown in jail. The ANC party were terrorists, just like they say about Hamas, thrown in jail for 30 years, came out of jail, became the president of the country, single-handedly destroyed apartheid. Not single-handedly, but the man won a peace prize for it, right? So we know it's his. So I like to parallel that story. Why? Because I can talk about Hamas without saying Hamas. I've paralleled the apartheid movement and Nelson
And
Mandela.
even Mandela himself like equated the two.
Oh, Mandela's, his famous quote is, we know all too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Right? So he was, South Africa, even to today, their president made a statement a few days ago. They'll always support it, and the reason is because they've been through it. No one knows apartheid better than South Africa.
Yeah.
So I say those two things, and then I'll do the third thing is the systemic racism. In the law, it states Jews have rights over non-Jews, period. So after I state those three things, then I'll go and, to address your question, which was...
What's happening now?
Yeah, what's
and
happening?
How do you,
Then I'll go and say, okay, so there's a ceasefire. So Gaza stopped firing rockets. Now Hamas has 100% of what they wanted, right? They just wanted no rockets from Hamas. That's it. Guess what?
Israel, you mean Israel has what they wanted? Yeah.
Yeah, so in Gaza, they stopped the missiles from Hamas, but we still have ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and systemic racism. The three things I just talked about all still exist.
Still happening.
So in the ceasefire, the way I look at it is Israel gets 100% of what they want in the ceasefire. Palestinians get maybe 10%. Fine, there's not children dying every day, but every day there's still ethnic cleansing, still apartheid, and still systemic racism. And until somebody steps up and argues any of those 3 points, to me, like you said, it's not a ceasefire. It's a ceasefire for one side, just for Israel, because they get what they want and the Palestinians get nothing.
Yeah.
Well, they get something, but not enough.
Not what they need.
What they need.
On that note, I know that we were going to touch on defense a little because like I think there's a couple things. Number one, the Iron Dome and how that is not a fair fight. But also like not only U.S. tax dollars, which we touched on, but Canadian tax dollars as well are going to support Israel's side of the military and stuff. So can you talk a little bit about...
This is why I think the Israel, like for the first time in my life, I think it is possible that Israel will fall and Palestinians will get justice. Because if you go to the Government of Canada website, not some website, but the gc.ca, and you look up what they say about Palestine, they say that we believe the occupied territory, it is an occupation. Then if you go to international law and look at it, the occupying power, it's clear in international law on anything. In fact, in 2014, the United Nations released an advisory report on the wall, the separation wall, and they said the occupying power under international law cannot claim self-defense because they have troops on the ground. Them just being there is an act of war, and it's an offensive posture, so they're not allowed. The law is not prepared to decide anything for them as self-defense. When people start to realize this and what it really means, they're going to start to say, like, we can't use this argument anymore. If Israel leaves the occupied territory, then we have a problem because they can claim self-defense. If Hamas is firing missiles, we need to protect our people, or rockets. But in the occupied territories, they cannot. In Gaza, they can. That's the danger, because Gaza is not occupied, right? There's no troops on the ground in Gaza. Gaza is just the Palestinians. They're enclosed in the prison.
And they have limited food and electricity
limited all
and
that.
water and
But
everything.
there's no Israeli military in Gaza.
Okay.
Maybe I should have said that earlier. That's why when you see on the news, they're like, they're preparing to go in on the ground, not just air attack, because they're not there on the ground. But the West Bank and East Jerusalem, occupied territory, military on the ground every day, right? So this defense argument, they're not going to be able to make it very much longer unless the Government of Canada changes their opinion and says, no, we don't consider it occupied. It's theirs. They can do what they want. That's a dangerous position for countries to take too, which we won't get into why, international law and whatever. But right as it stands now, Canada and the U.S. both consider it occupied territory. The world considers occupied territory. With that, this defense argument's starting to fall. But like I said, they have to make sure they keep this argument. If I was on the Israeli side, I would put all of my money in propaganda into let's make this our single argument. Israel needs to defend itself. Don't use any other arguments, because all other arguments will fail. But this one we have to keep up. If we don't, we're admitting to a war crime. That's how Israel looks at it.
So not to, I think for the sake of playing devil's advocate a little bit, right? Because I think it is important to make sure that
Yes.
we have at least some level of kind of internal conversation about that as well. How is it not self-defense and again, I can probably answer that myself, but I want you to answer.
No, it's a good.
How is it not self-defense, right? Because I had the benefit of going to school in New York. A lot of Israeli friends of mine, right? And they're great people. I enjoy their company. I love hanging out with them. In neutral territory, New York City, right? But a lot of them will just say, look, I want to live a peaceful life in Jerusalem. I want a career. I want to be able to go to the coffee shop and not have to worry about missiles raining down on me.
Rockets, yeah.
So how is it not self-defense in that way?
So for me, I mean, again, I'm a Palestinian, unapologetically Palestinian.
Yeah.
I personally think like two-state solution is dead. There's no way we're going to ever have it. I think it was a joke all along, just to get the Palestinians to say, just let us, for the future. Do this now, we'll give you something in the future. But to be fair, there is an argument on the other side. Like, I mean, I don't like this, but the argument, if I were to make it for them, I'd say, listen, fine. We'll leave, we've already left Gaza, but what we'll do is we'll open the borders, we'll let you bring stuff in and out, and we'll destroy all the settlements. By the way, the settlements in what we're talking about in the West Bank is almost 600, the latest number I saw, 620,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, in the area that's not Israel, the area that's supposed to be only for Palestinians.
Right. And by the way, what's the Palestinian population of West Bank?
In the West Bank, I think it's 2 to 3 million. I think it's similar to Gaza.
Okay.
Might be a little bit more now. I haven't checked that recently, but actually I think it's a little more than that, because I think the total they said was 5 million, so 2 million in Gaza, 3 in the West Bank.
And like a pretty small population in East Jerusalem?
East Jerusalem, yeah. East Jerusalem, I'm including that number in the West Bank, because East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank, right?
Okay.
Like if you look at the West Bank, the very tip, the western tip of the West Bank is where East Jerusalem is.
Right.
It's right at the end, and that's where it breaks. East Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, Israel, East Jerusalem, the beginning of the West Bank, all the way to the Jordan River.
Right. Got it. Okay.
So,
Self-defense.
Yeah. So yeah, like, I mean, when we're talking about like the West Bank and there is, like I said, an argument to be made in Israel, but outside of Israel, like, that's why I always take the conversation to the occupied territories or to Gaza, because in Israel, you know what? I'll give it to them. Fine. It's like the Canada argument, right? Like, and a lot of Israelis use this. They say, well, if you care so much about rights of indigenous people, then give back all the land to the native Indians, right? And I can't make that argument for Israel either. Like, I like, it would be hard to see if Palestinians get, like the hardcore Palestinians get exactly what they want, you're going to kick out all the Jews, right? You're going to kick them all out and take all the original land back. That's not going to happen. And that's not even reasonable, right? Like, maybe it's just, but it's not real. It's not a realist approach, right? Might be justice, but it's not real. So they do have an argument in Israel, and I'll give them that. Yeah, they shouldn't have to live their life in fear of rockets. But number one, it's super exaggerated. Right. Like, I read yesterday, I was reading like an anecdotal report of this. One of the injuries in Israel was a lady running to a bunker, and she fell, twisted her ankle, and broke her ankle. And I'm like, I find it very hard not to bite my lip and say, you're comparing that to a 6-year-old that was bombed in their bed? Well, you know what I mean? Like, it's so exaggerated. Like, come on. Like, I have friends that have been to Israel, and they're honest. They're like, dude, like, I was there during the bombing. He's like, honestly, for us, it was fun to watch the Iron Dome. It was like fireworks, just take down the rockets. He's like, I didn't see a single rocket get through. I did not. An Israeli friend of mine said, I deny that a single rocket got. I was there and I watched. It looked like little kids firing fireworks at the most advanced system in the world. So whether it's true or not is not the point. The point is, it is exaggerated, but I give them that right. They need the right of security. In Israel, fine, but in the occupied territory of Gaza, you cannot even make that argument. Because again, in the occupied territories, you are an occupying power. That's like going in as a soldier and a kid hitting you and saying, hey, don't hit me, I need my security. Right? Like we said, the Hanan Ashrawi quote, Israel's the only country in the world that asks for defense from their victims. Right?
Yeah.
So, but you're right.
And it's also the disproportionate response, right?
That's the other thing. Yeah.
And like the power imbalance and everything.
Yeah, I don't even get into that one, just because for me, like, who's the judge of what's disproportionate? Like, for me, one child that dies is disproportionate, right? And then at the end of the day, America always stands with Israel anyways. So, like the disproportionate argument, even though I understand it and it makes sense, it's a very hard argument to make. Right. By the way, I don't know if you guys know this, but the UN veto, the veto that the US has at the UN, not only is that if every country in the world is against it and the US vetoes it, it's not a law.
Yeah.
It's also stricken from the record, by the way. If the US vetoes it, you can't go back. Like, I can't go to the UN and say, hey, what was the 10th vote 10 years ago on the question of Palestine? They won't even show you. Only the U.S. has that type of.
Because I remember I did a project on this in high school, and I looked up like the list of things that the U.S. had vetoed, and somehow they had a list. I don't know why, but it was just like the most messed up stuff. It was it was like the U.S. vetoed that Israel shouldn't bomb hospitals and mosques, and I was like, pardon me, and like I'm in high school hearing like, oh, two sides, blah blah, and I'm like, this seems like not a two-sided thing. Yeah. And it was just like the UN, it's like communism. It's like nice in theory, and human nature just like
it just doesn't work. Yeah. By the way, you can see they'll list what happened, but you can't see the transcripts of what anyone said. Or for most of them, you can't even see who voted or abstained.
Yeah, it was just a list of motions, and it was horrifying to read.
It's horrifying.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. I think you had another point. Okay. So if you didn't, I wanted to actually go back to the arts thing for one quick second, if you don't mind. Because one thing that we didn't touch on, and I want to just briefly get your take on it, is you personally have a bit more of a background as well as it relates to utilizing your voice and artistic expression to try to get the message out there about the Palestinian plight. And I remember a few years ago there was a situation where you did a beautiful spoken word piece, and there was like this, for lack of a better word, just like this almost racist response to it, right? And my question is, at the time, how did that work to both create awareness as well as hopefully build understanding and bridges within sort of the community, which is at the end of the day our entire intention with the Mosquers as well, right? Utilize art to both build bridges as well as create awareness. At the time, how did that piece, I think, result in, or did it not, right? And I think as a follow-up to that, have you found that and we've kind of touched on this throughout the interview today, have you found that the general response from the broader community is one that is more receptive? We've touched on how it's still a little bit more silent in its approval, but do you find that it's at least a little bit more receptive now if you were to do something like that today as compared to then? Yeah,
so that was, I can't remember what year it was, but there's a very famous place in Chicago called the Green Mill. Yeah. And my sister-in-law lives in Chicago, so I get to go there like once or twice a year. She's my wife's favorite sister, so I'm forced to go there once or twice a year. I love Chicago. It's my favorite U.S. city. Yeah. So, at the time I was doing a lot, like I love poetry, I love music, I love these kinds of things. So I was like, I'm going to try my hand at writing a poem. And I remember in the video I said it was born at a checkpoint in the West Bank, and I did it in memory of Rachel Corrie, who died defending Palestinians, right? So it was this long, drawn-out poem just about what I felt about the Palestinian cause. Right. And at the end of the poem, so they had 3 judges, and the Green Mill is very well known. It's one of the poet hotspots in Chicago. So I was surprised they actually let me even speak my poem, but when I did it, I got really high scores. Like I got 8.7 out of 10, and someone gave me I can't remember, like at 8.9, and then the third judge gave me a 1.5. And so even the guy, if you watch the video, he's like, oh man, I hope you're packing. Like he said, like you're going to get, because the artistic community is very pro-Palestinian. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but Palestine cause is a very left-wing cause, right? So the people there were, but I found that the problem with Palestine in that community is they love to leave the religion out of it, right? Like, I find that even if you put anything religious in there, they're kind of turned off because, for better or for worse, religion does have that kind of they feel like you're not for everyone's rights, just for your religion's rights, right? So it's difficult. So there was a lot of people there supported me in the Green Mill, saying you know what, you should be allowed to say what you do and blah blah blah. But there was also, like you said, a lot of silent support. People didn't say anything. No one kind of. There was no backlash towards the judge except there physically. People were screaming at the end of the video, because the whole point, my poem, almost every word ended in shun. Palestinian nation, organization, blah, blah, blah. The whole poem. So people started yelling, extermination at the judge and stuff like that. Like, it got very heated. Like, people were using things that were almost borderline anti-Semitic, right? That's where the danger gets in this discussion. So it got very heated, and the judge even came up to me and said, hey, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm surprised you would even say these things. It's disgusting and blah, 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 and all this stuff. And it was kind of closed, and I just went home. I never thought anything of it. And then I noticed on social media, you get trolls and whatnot. Today, if I did that poem, I think people would just cheer. And because things that I was saying at the time were kind of borderline. But really, it was a pretty safe poem. Now, it would just be like everyone would agree with it. I never said anything too racist or anti-Semitic or what could even be considered. So that community's opened up, and now there's a lot of poets in the Palestinian community, like a lot. And again, I think it comes out of being so oppressed that they have so much to say. So I feel like it's changed. I feel like public opinion's changed a lot, even in those left-wing groups where it was like, progressive but Palestine. It's starting to be like, no, we got to look in the mirror and say, like, either we support human rights for all or we don't, right? And that's, I think, where that's going. So,
and even like it's pretty wonderful to see just in the international community too. Like, even at the driving rally here, there were so many cars that had like a Palestinian flag and a Turkish flag and a Somali flag, and it was like so cool to kind of see all these communities coming together to be like, this isn't about anything other than like equity across the board.
It was so it was so eclectic. By the way, like at that event, I wanted to drive with the group, but I was also in charge of the traffic. The last car that left, I don't know if you know, the path was to go from 127th Street north side around the Henday to Gateway. The last car that left, or the first car that left, arrived 5 minutes after the last car that left.
Yeah.
So we literally had like the whole thing. It was nuts.
A friend of ours was at the front, and he was like, "Yeah, like we're already back at the parking lot. We're like, we like just
like
it
was nuts." And my brother-in-law's hilarious. He's like, he took some pictures to show you how diverse. And I don't know, I don't mean to be rude or anything, but he's like, he took a picture of a bunch of girls, and he's like, when you have basic white girls cheering for you, you're doing something right. So I was like, like, it was just funny because it was like all these girls that are like, yeah, free Palestine or whatever, like those kind of, I want their support too. Like, I want everybody's support. I don't care what you know what I mean? So it was everyone. Like, everyone supported us. It blew me away. Like, I don't know if you guys know the Raging Grannies.
Yes.
Yeah. So they, they're very active, and
Were they there?
Yeah, one of them, not at that event, but one of them came up to me at a previous event and said, I just want you to know I'm of Jewish descent, and I can't stand what the Israeli government's doing, right? And like, these are the kind of people that we shouldn't ostracise, because I've seen people say like, if you're not Muslim, this is not your cause, or if you're not Palestinian, these types of things. Again, we've been doing that for 73 years. We've seen what it's gotten to us. Let's start opening this up and being more honest with ourselves. The thing I love too is like, when you play devil's advocate, we really need to do that way more, because we have to be honest with ourselves. Like, like there's people now that are in Palestine that are arguing amongst themselves as, this is religious, this is not religious, right? Like, we need to have those honest conversations. Let's not hide any skeletons in the closet. Let's bring it all out in the open. People will appreciate that more. And
especially because then when you're having the conversation and you are challenged, like you've thought about it, like you have a response to be like, great point. Actually, yeah, like potentially within Israel, fine, make the self-defense argument, but like, you're in an occupying territory committing human rights violations outside of that, so like stop that. And like, that's like, like I now am more prepared if anyone were to ever ask me to be like, actually but like not outside of that. And so I think it helps too, because I think I think it's also, I was having this conversation with friends too, like there's a certain point where I feel like I'm a pretty agreeable person, and I'm willing to like talk to people of different opinions than myself. But it's interesting how strongly I feel about certain things, and I'm like, thinking about it, I'm never gonna move on this. Like, I'm never gonna think this is okay. I'm fully against it, whatever. And people on the other side feel the exact same way. Like they feel just as strongly and just as justified in their view as I do, even though I'm like, but you're so wrong, and I'm so right. But like, it's it doesn't matter. Like that, they feel just as strongly, and so like to be able to look at that other perspective and be able to talk to that other perspective is like such a skill, and like no movement is going to succeed without it. I was just going to ask about Palestine 101, but like, but I don't know if you wanted.
I'd love to really quickly.
Oh, yes, please.
Really quickly. So it hasn't started yet, but I've had conversations with principals in the city who's asked if I can like, I gave a talk at the Edmonton Islamic Academy to about 96 staff. Their concern was some of the non-Muslim teachers don't know much about Palestine, so they're saying things like, that Muslim students are getting offended by, saying like, oh, we want peace for all sides, and they're like, hey, that's like saying all lives matter. So they said, can you just come in and talk to them about it? And so I did that, and then I had another principal reach out. There's some Jewish and Muslim kids. So what we want to do is start this thing called Palestine 101. We're not going to get too deep into any of them, but we want to give people talking points. We want people to be able to say things, arguments that make sense to the other side. Not, I get it that children are dying, but you don't know what that sounds like on the other side. For the other side, all they're saying is, well, our children are dying too. Why are yours more important than ours? That's not an argument. That's an emotional response. It's not an argument, right? An argument is there's an occupying power asking for defense. Does that make sense to you? You know, these types of things. So Palestine 101 is basically going to be a 45-minute workshop. It's with this person that I told you, Human Rights Commission. I'm going to facilitate it. I'll talk a little bit, but I want him to cover most of it. And we're just going to put it out to communities. We're going to run it through certain organizations.
My work wants that. They actually asked me about it. I was like, I might have a guy, so we'll talk about that later.
We'll see how it goes. The one thing is it might have to be changed a little bit because, again, it's unapologetically Palestinian. It's our narrative. I'm not going to defend the Israeli side. If you want that, get someone from their side. It's our narrative, and it's how we see the conflict, so that's what we're putting out. So there have been a lot of groups that have come out and asked for it. So that's we're going to launch that. And by the way, in the last 2 weeks, I've had like 7 or 8 different groups. I have a group of doctors that have said, look, we have 8 volunteer physicians. We want to do mental health assessments for people in Gaza. We can do it through Skype or Zoom. We just need someone to run the whole thing through. And so right now I think I'm a lightning rod because people think, for some reason they see me talk in the media, so they think I am the Palestinian in Edmonton, like the whole cause. I'm not, honestly. Quite honestly, people are doing so much more work than I am. I'm just that guy that you see his face, so you think I'm doing all the work. I'm not. So there's been a ton of stuff like that I'm going to start to pass on to other people. So like if it's a doctor's group, hey, I find a good doctor that understands, go run with it. You guys want to do something artistic, I'll find someone good, go run with it. There's a lot of projects you will see in the next month that we're going to roll out, just one after the other. So that's what Palestine
That's so
is.
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, so to wrap it up, I want to ask you a question that probably is an unfair question to ask, but you touched on it already in that you don't think that a two-state solution is necessarily the solution. So what, in your opinion, does a successful outcome look like for the Palestinian people?
That is the question, right?
Exactly.
Oh man, it's such a difficult question because like I've tried to do my research as much as I can, and like if you talk to the real intellectuals like Noam Chomsky and Finkelstein and these guys who've really been at the heart of this Palestine thing for a long time, from an objective view, I would say, because they're non-religious, they're banned from Israel, they don't like them very much in Palestine, some of these guys, right? They've all said like 2-state solution, 1-state solution. This is just like a blanket, on top, just to let people think that we're working on something, right? The reality of the situation is you can't have a 2-state solution because there's no balance of power. If you were talking about like a country that had an army and an airport, like I always tell people, you have a military force fighting a country that doesn't have an army to defend itself, nor an airport to flee the fighting if they wanted to, right? So this is the imbalance of power. Before you even get to 2-state solution and how you're going to live, you need to correct the imbalance of power. It doesn't have to be corrected all the way. Like the Palestinians can and will still be at a disadvantage, but at the very least just a little bit. Like you have the Palestinian Authority who's supposed to be like the police force, an 18-year-old Jew. He told me this, a Californian. I was at a checkpoint, and by the way, if you've seen the checkpoints, we're like cattle. They're literally metal bars, and they herd us like cattle. And I was speaking English. This guy, he brought me to the front. He's like, come up here. He's like, you speak English? I'm like, yeah. He's like, what are you doing here, man? I'm like, yeah, I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. We started talking. He's like, honestly, I'm from California. My dad's hardcore. He made me serve in the IDF because every Jew has to serve 2 years, right? And he's like, I hate this place. He's like, no offense, dude. I don't care about Palestine or Israel. I just want to serve my time and go back to America. We talked about basketball. We like just 2 normal guys talking, right? The majority of Israeli soldiers are like this now. They don't care about the cause. They're non-religious. They don't really care. They're just like, you know what? I just want to be in America. That's why they're giving up on American Jews' support for Israel, right? So this is what's really happening on the ground, right? Meanwhile, the imbalance of power is they're trying to maintain it as much as they can. So I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm not a political expert. I don't pretend to be. I can just tell you what I see. Right. If they put me in charge from tomorrow, I would never be able to do it. The only solution is, in my opinion, you're going to have one country there ruled by a force that's at least kind of equal to everyone, right? Like you never, like it's been going on forever. It might be the right solution to have a UN-led government there, which people don't like because you're talking about one world governments, right? I don't want to go there, but you know what I mean? Like, because there's so many conflicts within the one conflict that I don't think you can have a realistic one or two state solution. And I don't even like that language. Like my cousin Mahdi, he's a psychologist in the city. You might know him, Dr. Mousa Qasqas. He always tells me, he's big in the Palestinian cause. He always says, look, if we liberated Palestine tomorrow, if it was liberated 100%, go around and ask all these leaders, okay, now what? He's like, nobody has a plan.
Right.
We want liberation, but none of us have thought post-liberation what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
We're still so divided. Like, I don't even like to talk about the divisions in Palestine because you have Hamas and Fatah. You know, there's a guy, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he's like the spiritual leader of Hamas. He was really good guy, actually. They asked him about Fatah and Hamas. He said, when you have a boot on your chest, you don't look right and left to the guys that are being put down like you and say, hey, are you Shia or Sunni? Are you Ismaili or Sunni? Are you Muslim? Are you Fatah or Hamas? What do? You remove the boot first, right? Then you start looking at the people around you. He said, this is what's happening. We've got boots on our chest, and what we're doing is we're looking at the guy laid down beside us and saying, are you with Fatah? Are you with the Palestinian Authority? Or are you with Hamas? Or we're not even at the point where we've removed the boot. Imagine when we remove the boot, then we get up and look around and, okay, now here's the Shia, here's the guy I don't agree with. You know what I mean? Like, we need to be honest with ourselves. If we think that we can have a free Palestine and it's coming, let's start planning for after Palestine is free, right? And I'm not there yet. I'll be honest, I don't know. I'm still working on let's free Palestine. After Palestine's free, who knows, man?
Well, and I can only assume that the even like very real geographical division of the Palestinian territories would make it even more complex. You know what I mean? So
we didn't even get into like what the people of Gaza think about the people of the West Bank.
well, exactly, right?
And that's like that's internal politics that like I don't even think we should talk about. Honestly, it's a scary topic, but but we know it. We know the racism in the Arab world. I won't shy away from it. There's a deep racism in the Arab world. I went to Hajj in 2004 and I heard like one of the most religious guys in the world say, oh, the Egyptians are here, Hajj is ruined. And I looked at him like, whoa, dude, what are you talking about? Like, you're being racist in the Hajj? And he's like, you're young and you don't understand. Egyptians are scammers and this and that. And like, we have so many problems that we need to start being honest about them, or else when Palestine is free, these problems will all rear their ugly head. So we just
and it would be such a shame to then like have these free people have this free land, and then like they're all just like mad at each other and just like not working together to
and they're all going to use excuses to justify it, right? Like me personally, like I love my Islam and I look at my Islam a certain way. Like there's a hadith, not a sahih hadith, but a hadith that says the Muslim should be like the raindrop. Wherever he falls, he benefits the land. And that's how I think as Muslims we should be, right? Like you have people that come here and, this is a kafir country, and the dumbest thing, like they'll litter and say, well, this is, not Dar Sunnah, Dar al-Harb, and all these things, and it's just like, man, like you're so far off. Like we make the minor things major and the major things minor, right? Why aren't you wearing a beard? You go up to a guy who doesn't pray, doesn't even know Aqidah. Why aren't you wearing a beard? First talk to the guy about prayer and his connection to his creator, not about growing up. You know what I mean? Like we have this, like, it's so weird, and it's a religious psychosis. That's a whole other show, I guess, for you guys. But like there is, honestly, especially in Islam, like I believe it's the truth. I believe it's the best religion in the world. But by the same token, because it's so strong and so weighty and heavy, it can force you to go, it can hurt you if you do it wrong, right? So, like that's where I stand, and I think we just have to be more honest with ourselves about that.
There you go. So. On that note, Mousa, thank you so much for your time, man. This was
you guys so much. I love this, and like I said, it's so nice to be able to just speak in an environment where you're like, they're not just waiting to catch me on an anti-Semitic thing, right? So it's so nice. So I thank you guys so much for everything.
Appreciate it, man.
Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Halal Gap. Join us in 2 weeks for our next guest, Shiroz Khan. The Halal Gap is a Mosquers production. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok by searching Mosquers Film Festival. Thank you to our sound editor, Hamada Arafi, our tile artist, Narmin Sayed, our videographer for this week's episode, Ijlal Amer, our video editor, Arish Jamil, and our producer, Asif Qureshi. On behalf of Sofia and myself, thank you for joining us, and we pray that Palestine will soon be free.